Yeah. I know I talked about this already with the Canucks, but there's an argument to be made that I'm doing myself a disservice by being a Habs fan as well and not talking about this. Of course, you already know what I'm talking about. It's in the title, it's in the thumbnail. Let's talk about Taylor Hall and the Habs. Now, why exactly am I talking about this? Well, as with the Vancouver thing, where the Canucks were mentioned in a Sportsnet article talking about potential Hall destinations, EJ Hradek on NHL Network was talking about Taylor Hall and Montreal and how there may be a fit there if Hall was put on the trade block between now and the trade deadline on the New Jersey Devils side of things. Now, obviously, I'm not going to just repeat everything that he said, but I will give my own opinions and all that as well. Hradek is asked about the overall status quo of Taylor Hall and how things are shaping up with the Devils and whether or not the Habs specifically are a potential suitor for Hall's contract. And for the most part, when I looked at this, I looked at the headline, I looked at the tweet because they tweeted out a video about the segment. I'll leave a link in the description to that Twitter video. I was like, it kind of does make a little bit of sense because Hradek actually mentions this in the video. There are only a number of teams that would actually be able to take on a Taylor Hall contract because the way things are right now, Hall is making $6 million and he's going to be making much more than that next year. And the Habs are certainly one of the teams that do have more cap space than the rest of the league. Now, that's not to say that the Canadiens could absorb an entire $9 million cap hit from Taylor Hall if he asks. No, that's not what's going to happen here. The Canadiens have about $5-ish million in cap space, but they do have a few assets that they could be prone to moving that could free up some space as well. So, taking a look at it from a financial point of view, the Canadiens are in a better position than most teams to actually allow themselves to take on a Hall. If they wanted to trade a Petrie or whatever, that's another $5.5 million in space cleared up. Boom, you got $10 million free. And mind you, that's not taking into account the re-signing that's going to need to happen for Domi, for Mete, guys like that. But just in a short-term perspective, there's interesting things that you can take a look at. Hradek is asked about the overall impact that a Taylor Hall could have. And he actually says that Hall would not be the one that he would say could help the Canadiens the most. He does say that the Canadiens would benefit more from an elite center rather than an elite left winger, which is a fair argument. We do know that the Canadiens do have a fairly strong winger core with Suzuki stepping up in the way he has, and of course Drouin is there. But down the middle, things are a little bit weaker than they could be. Sure, I love Deneau, I love Kotkaniemi, I love Domi, but they don't have an elite number one center. And of course, I'm just talking about the basis on how things are traditionally set in the lineup. I know Domi and Suzuki have kind of been switching up their kind of wingers and center combos, but the point still remains. If the Canadiens were to choose one of an elite left winger or one of an elite center, the center would probably be a better choice. Now, does that dismiss the idea that Taylor Hall could potentially be a Canadien? Not entirely. We do know the Canadiens have gone for big fish, high talent elite players before. Hradek mentions it. Hey, Aho, last year, they tried to do that because they want elite talent. They wanted an elite center. And if the Canadiens are in a position where a Taylor Hall is available, I definitely think that they would try to go for it. Of course, that's just at the very beginning stage. We're not talking about the trade return or the impact or whatever. So let's get into that right here. What exactly could a trade return look like for the New Jersey Devils in exchange for Taylor Hall? Well, first off, if we're going to take a look at value for value, we're going to take a look at what the Canadiens actually need to do to free up the space as well. I said it earlier, I'd say Petrie. Sure, you could argue that he's been the best Habs defenseman this year, but he's $5.5 million that you're probably going to need to get rid of if you want to open up that space for a Taylor Hall. Sure, there are other players that you can get rid of that could also give up the money to, but you're not going to trade Weber. He's your captain. His contract is huge. You're not going to trade prospects because that's not going to free up your space. You're not going to trade Carey Price because, oh boy, you're not moving that contract. And honestly, there are a few other wingers that you could probably entertain this idea with. Thomas Tatar is a guy making $4.8 million for the next 2 years, and I could honestly see him potentially being in a deal like this. Imagine if you wanted to swap Tatar and a pick or a prospect for Hall. I think the value kind of maxes out in the same way. Obviously, Hall is an MVP in the league. He's a 100-point caliber player. He's probably worth a little bit more than just Tatar, so you definitely need to add if you're in the Habs position. But that raises another question. How much better are you improving your team if you swap out a Tatar for a Hall? In my opinion, the best way to get the effectiveness out of there is to keep all your wingers intact and add a Taylor Hall, because you're just boosting your forward core and you're making everybody else on your team better. Do the Canadiens have the option to do that? I don't know. Then there's a different idea of combining players. So instead of trading one big fish and a prospect for Hall, you trade several medium-sized fish. You trade away a Paul Byron and a Sherratt in the deal. But at the same time, when you're taking a look at it like that, sure, the cap space kind of works out, but what are the Devils really getting back? You're going to need to include a really big piece to actually make a deal like that worth it. And when you take a look at pieces that are really worth it in the Habs system, you got Danault, who is a center, who is valuable, and who is really good for the amount of money that he costs. But at the same time, no, you're not trading a center if you're the Habs. You got the younger guys and the Caulfields, the Primos, but who knows how big the fan base would explode if you traded one of those guys. So I don't know if I would really entertain that. But in my opinion, though, the entire Montreal Canadiens window for Stanley Cup contention is gonna be a little bit down the line. It's not now. And Taylor Hall is a guy whose prime, it's in right now. And if you're willing to sacrifice a little bit of the future for help now and in the immediate short-term future, then I guess you could say, yeah, we should go after Taylor Hall. But in my opinion, I don't necessarily know if that's the right move. Do I see it as a viable move that could be possible? Yes. But do I see it as the best move available? No. Unless, of course, Marc Bergevin trades away some of the other salary for other youthful pieces and gets Taylor Hall in the offseason via free agency, that's a different story. But obviously, this is a different scenario. We're talking about a potential trade, and from that perspective, there's a lot of weaving and dealing that you have to think about if you're Marc Bergevin and the Habs. But enough with the actual philosophical stuff on whether or not it should be done. Let's talk about the hypotheticals on what if Hall was actually on the Habs. Imagine if the Habs are just out of the playoffs and they acquire a Taylor Hall at the deadline. Are they making the playoffs then? Maybe. Maybe so. Hall is a player who could potentially get 100 points, and he would indeed help out this Canadiens team. Imagine a first line of Taylor Hall playing alongside of Danault and Gallagher. That is just an incredibly interesting idea to think about. Sure, I love Tatar, but take him off of that first line spot, put Hall in there, or maybe move Domi back to the center, move Suzuki to the right wing, have a second line of Hall, Domi, Suzuki. Oh boy, that sounds incredible as well. Imagine the puck movement, the skills, the shots, and the goals. That would be crazy. You'd have a guy like Armia on your bottom six in the lineup, and that honestly sounds like a really good idea. And that's not even thinking about Drouin. Maybe you move Suzuki into the bottom six. You have a second line of Hall, Domi, Drouin. Something like that. I don't know. Move somebody to the other wing. That actually sounds deadly. Sure, it's not the number one center that the Habs could use and would probably prefer over a number one left winger, but having a Taylor Hall is probably much better for your team lineup-wise and skill-wise than it is not having a Taylor Hall. It's just, you have to take a look at the possibilities, the trade scenarios, the overall idea of how you're going to pull a trade like that off, but it's an interesting idea nonetheless. Which is why I decided to talk about it, because EJ Hradek does bring up some interesting points, and I thought they would be interesting to share. Hope you enjoyed this video. Social 9, and bye.